Hello, my name is Roy Poyan, and I am the Director of Families Impacted by Opioids. Thank you for joining us today for this episode of Childhood Trauma in Substance Use Disorders. What we're going to take a look at today is the issue of childhood trauma. Very few people want to find this in their families, but if it's there, most need to identify it, assist in supporting it by getting the right level of care, and then learning what they can do to create an environment for this person to heal, resolve, and build coping skills around what's happened to them in the past. Childhood trauma takes on a completely different way of looking at life. If you've had 4 or more childhood traumas that are significant, you're 60% more likely to be using substances to self-medicate and deal with that trauma. See, the issue is that the trauma left undiagnosed and unresolved will fester. It will develop over time, and the person will start to experience depression on what they recall in this trauma had happened to them and what it means to them in their life. Not having built the right levels of coping skills and counseling, through counseling, they are left vulnerable in the future to what this trauma means to them. And that's often why we find them in this situation. 76% and more are actually identified as having had a childhood trauma that are currently using substances, misusing substances. So with that in mind, we see such a prevalence, and it becomes very obvious to the social science that we need to also help the person resolve those issues at the same time that we're helping them to resolve their addiction and possibly their codependency or other types of occurrences that are happening in the family. You see, we're not just talking about the person that's misusing substances. This childhood trauma may have affected the other members of the family, which kind of creates a functionality situation for them that's left unresolved. So as we're looking at the family, we would look at each member of the family to determine if in fact childhood trauma has presented itself, and if so, what steps we should be looking to take in order to help to resolve and manage that. Let me read to you just this one statement regarding Kaiser Permanente's adverse childhood experience study. It indicated that a child who experiences 4 or more traumatic events is 5 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 60% more likely to become obese, and up to 46 times more likely to become an injection drug user than the general population. I think that those science studies are relevant for us. They don't guarantee anything, but they should raise our consciousness as to the importance of this. And for that reason, they're included in this 32 episode learning for the family. And what we're trying to do is to build your armament so that you can take yourself out of harm's way regarding fentanyl. Now, as we're starting to look at the different types of scales in identifying childhood trauma, that's the good news. We know how to see it, we know how to treat it, we know how to find the best results in you moving forward with a better life. But it all begins with the fact that the family takes the time, as we're suggesting here in this episode, we all do. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at childhood trauma, the traumatic inventory, the emotional degradation scale, so it's called the EDS, and then drug abuse screening test, because all of these are intermixed in what we need to know regarding childhood trauma as the person is living their life today. Now, in saying all this, we are not to address the childhood trauma itself. If you believe that there has been childhood trauma of a certain type, and there's many types, there's about 32 different types, if not more, of traumas. Bullying is one of them. then what we want to do is we want to make sure that we actually have a tool that helps us to assess that, and that's called the ACEs tool. Any primary care doctor can administrate that. Other types of clinicians can do the same. So with that in mind, we would like for you to not take on the responsibility of dealing with it. What we're asking of you is that you educate yourself as to what childhood trauma is, how you notice it, and then what to do about it in terms of supporting a professional becoming involved. Once the professional is brought on board, which should be immediately, you'll find that there is a path for you and that it's going to be satisfactory in terms of what they're able to achieve. So don't be worried if you have to address this. Just know that there are a lot of really strong evidence-based programs that get you through this. You know, let's take a closer look at what this means to you, because right now it's just in a book, and that doesn't mean an awful lot for us. Why don't you join us at the family table, and we'll take some time to understand and break it down so that it's more clearer to you exactly what your role is when it comes to childhood trauma inside the family.
Okay, we're back to the family table again. This is where we have discussions on topics that are of critical value to the family. And what we're talking about is the area of childhood trauma. As we had addressed, the childhood trauma experience is one that is very personal. And for us to take time now to examine each member of the family is very important, because the family is going to experience the trauma of and the complications, the intermixings of issues related to substance use disorder inside the family dynamic. It's going to push down on each individual family member, and that compression is actually going to cause the family to have to take measures on their own individually from their own coping skills and their own perspective of their individual lives, separate from the family, even though they're in a family dynamic. And the question then becomes, because we had talked in an earlier episode about functionality, but the question almost becomes survivability. How well is each person in the family set for that compression, those issues, the heaviness of them, what they mean to the family, what they mean to themselves as individuals. The interesting aspect of trauma is left undiagnosed, and honestly, most are left undiagnosed. They fester, and then they develop. They kind of create a little bit of a life of their own inside the person. Often they're kept secret, which then creates other kinds of experiences of guilt and depression. So let's take a look at what we've identified as an aspect of the childhood trauma inside the family, both individually and as a family as a whole. And we'll turn in the study guide to that section that describes what the learning objectives are. And we'll identify basically what we want to first kind of like notice is how prevalent is it? Well, 76% of the time, a person that is experiencing substance use disorders has also experienced some point in their past either a major or a mild trauma in their lives, and that has had a role to play in their strength and in their ability to cognitively and emotionally and logically in the different parts of their brain process current events. So is it fair to say if you've had trauma, you're weakened? That's not an accurate statement. Is it fair to say that it may be more complex than if you didn't have the trauma? Oh, definitely. That would be, a fair statement to make. So then the degree is, to what degree did the trauma itself impact this person? Well, the degree is not really ours to judge, because what might be of significance to you may not be to them, or vice versa. It's an individual by individual, and I often don't like that, because it's almost like a way of getting out answering the question. But it really is an individual by individual case, and it needs to be addressed in that same manner. So in all situations regarding trauma, and I mean all, we should be empathetic. We should be understanding. We should be willing to meet that person where they are, not where we think they should be with that issue. And then be helpful and be responsible and be responsive in what types of things you may be suggesting that they need to do in order to deal with it. And then while they're dealing with it, start to develop patterns of learning how to heal from it. So that's going to require a therapist. And we strongly encourage that if you have the opportunity to identify trauma in your family and any of your family members, your mother, father, sisters, brothers, and the one that's experiencing substance misuse, you'll want to be sure to get a professional engaged, and that should be time urgent. So it necessitates you kind of like being aware that you should look at this, because it's possible, and then not be afraid to take the steps needed to get the proper level of care. So what are some of the areas that we can start to say, hey, Roy, how do you recognize trauma? I mean, it purposely hides itself. Trauma wants to stay alive if it were a thing, and it does stay alive. The question is, how does its life inside of us exhibit itself? Well, in some cases, it's going to look like anxiety. A person experiencing anxiety doesn't necessarily have to have had a trauma to be experiencing anxiety, but often a person that has had anxiety will display anxiety, maybe depression. They may manifest certain areas of their personality that don't really make sense to who they are. It looks oblique. It doesn't look like it belongs. So there are tools that we can use to help us to better understand, is this what we're seeing in this person? And once again, like in the other parts of psychology and these social sciences, we're using behavior as our metric. We can't really take a blood reading and say, okay, you've got this cursor and therefore you had trauma. It's gonna express itself in other ways. So often when you say to a family in therapy, have you had any traumatic experiences? Their first knee-jerk reaction is, no, none to think of. And then when you start to say, okay, well, let's take a look at how your life was when you were between, say, 5 and 12. And they start to describe something, and then they mention something that, for example, let's say I was bullied in junior high school. Oh, okay, how badly, or to what degree? And then they start to describe it. And then you ask, well, how did that make you feel? And the next thing you know, you're uncovering this very big trauma. And although their first recourse was to not let you know, they start to understand that's what this is. And then when they start to understand, but it was the anxiety, or it was the addiction, or it was the depression, or it was the general personality disorder, narcissism, all kinds of different things play off of trauma that brought me to this session, say, with a professional. Well, yes, that's true, but it's not the cause. And we do not want other family members doing this level of care. Don't do that. All of us are not trained, okay? I'm not trained, and I'm a board certified mental health coach. That's someone who I would refer up to who actually has trauma training and is a counselor for that specific area, because they'll get the best recourse and results from doing that. So in this case, you're not the medic, on a battlefield, and we don't want you throwing gauzes on there and saying, good, the bleeding stopped. You know, he's doing much better, he doesn't have anxiety, I was able to help them. No, probably not, honestly, if we were to be genuine about what we are capable to do and what we're not trained. So I don't mean to overemphasize that, but yet I want to overemphasize it because I want everyone to understand we don't treat trauma. Professionals treat trauma. And I also want you to understand, which is a truth, it's treatable. All of these conditions are treatable. There are things we can do about it. So we know more about mental health than we've ever known before in the past. And the days of sitting on a couch and spending the next 62 sessions, those are in the past. That was in the 70s and the 80s. They now have methods and methodologies and empirically proven ways to help us towards a resolution and a satisfaction much faster now, with in some cases just a few therapy sessions. So don't be reserved in suggesting that, okay, our next step is therapy, because in trauma, it always is the next step, and time may be of the essence. So as we start to look at the different types of impacts where trauma will present itself, there's like 7 types of really obvious areas that we can ask ourselves as a standard, and fortunately they're in your study guide, so you can go to them. I'm just going to take a minute to read them. My child has been exposed to many potential traumatic experiences. Okay, true or false? And if it is, okay, you should get an assessment, and we'll describe that assessment in just a minute. My child has difficulty controlling emotions and easily can become sad, angry, and scared. The word easily is important there. My child has trouble controlling behaviors. My child often exhibits significant changes in activity level, appearing overly active or agitated, sometimes, and then calmer, or even quite slowed down at other times. So if you're seeing this behavior, don't panic. Just, it may be that if you see other alike behaviors and there's a certain amount of time that goes by and you're seeing a repeat that seems to be, a founded behavior, then yeah, you're warranted to see a professional and have them do, it's a very easy to administer assessment tool. My child has trouble remembering, concentrating, and focusing. He or she sometimes appears spacey, and that's because their mind is being consumed with these other thoughts regarding the trauma. It's exhibiting itself. My child has a problem with eating, sleeping, and complains about physical symptoms, even though doctors find nothing physically wrong to explain these symptoms. Well, that's true, because when you saw the doctors, you may not have thought to say, I would like a child trauma assessment done. And it doesn't have to be a child, it could be an adult. My child has difficulty in forming and sustaining relationships with other children and adults. The word difficulty is kind of a mild, moderate, and severe, it doesn't have to be dramatic. It could be a mild and moderate, in which case it's still worthy of being looked at if you're seeing it as a characteristic. My child seems to need and seek out more stimulation than other children, or can easily distract. They're distracted by noises, or they're distracted by sounds, or they're distracted by movements, and other changes in the environment. It's noticeable. I mean, we all respond to our environment, but this is more dramatic and it's noticeable. My child has many mental diagnoses, but none of them quite seem to explain their problems. Well, that can sometimes happen. It's not necessarily a misdiagnosis. It may be that the diagnosis is correct. The cause of the diagnosis may be what we're really describing here. And we always want to get to the root cause of things. It's the purpose of going into therapy sessions, is to find out, well, where is this being exasperated from? Because if we can take care of that, then we take care of the symptoms themselves. My child is taking medication for these diagnoses, but the medicines are not helping. Well, that's right, because the medicines may be addressing the symptom and not the problem, and therefore the problem is always breaking through. So those are the 7 different types of questions that you could be asking yourself. Now, it's important to know, as I had said before, it's encouraging and it's helpful to know that once identified as trauma, things are going to happen and they're going to be very good for you, okay? So I think the real troubling part about trauma is the exposing and giving it air and giving it a place to be seen and breathe. So then we can determine what is it and how do we properly address it so that we can heal it. And over time, we do heal it. That's the encouraging part. So the different scales of trauma kind of help us to understand. It's not always a mild, moderate, and severe, but in terms of scaling, often we find that with treatments. It helps us to understand the intensity of the treatment that's required in the plan of care. But in terms of the tools that are used to make a proper diagnosis, there is a childhood trauma questionnaire. Everything's an acronym. So this is called a CTQ. And then there is a traumatic event inventory. You're taking inventory of everything that's happened. And you commonly see that in the beginning of a counseling therapy session, where to inventory things allows you to come back to item number 3. And then you find out that item number 3 causes these types of things to happen, whereas trauma number 2 causes those things to happen. So, and trauma number 1 might be responsible for trauma number 4. And you start to see the correlations of how things are presenting themselves as observable behaviors that we can measure and understand, but tied to the trauma itself, of which was never diagnosed or healed. So there's a emotional dysregulation scale, and it's a 12-item self-report. Some of these, like the childhood trauma questionnaire, is 25 items, so it's a little bit longer of a questionnaire. In the traumatic events, there's 17 categories to the Gillespie, what they call a TEI. And then the drug abuse screening tool, what they call a DAST, and that's very commonly used, DAST, DAST, drug abuse screening tool. It has 20 questions. And that's often used as a re-examination or a reassessment, they call it. So you'll get an assessment, and that creates okay, we've got a situation here that we need to address. And then you'll end up getting a diagnosis from the assessment. And then from the diagnosis, it attaches itself to what types of treatment for this diagnosis is reasonable and should be put into place. But that plan of treatment then is what's implemented ongoing, and then a reassessment is done in order to suggest, okay, how far have we come? Is the plan of treatment on target? Now, what could take place, and we'll discuss this in much greater detail in the other episodes when we're talking about the disease, but it's true here too. You may find that resolution has been obtained, and they move from this was a very much troubling trauma that's expressing itself in other places of our life, and now over time we're seeing a difference in the treatment is kind of working, in the sense of we're starting to heal, and we understand it better, we have a place to put it, and we're comfortable with that place. And now these other experiences or behaviors are not seen as often and are starting to decline in frequency. So if it is the fact that a variance occurs, so you're going along treatment plan, all of a sudden you spike, and they have, let's say, a major depression as a result, then in that treatment plan, they can go back and say, okay, well, what kind of happened right before the spike happened in the variance? And now we can determine, was there something connected to that relative to the trauma that has attached itself and now has the ability to create an even worse situation for us mentally and how we're coping with it. So I don't mean to get too medical on us in terms of this discussion, but I think it's important for you to know that the healing process is a matter of time in a plan of treatment that you can have an expectation, and when things are changing, because it's on a plan of treatment, then we can determine, maybe cause and effect, what happened and why did they cause that. So what do we do when we're starting to ask the questions? We want you to take responsibility and ownership of the awareness part of trauma. Not necessarily, although you do have a role to play in creating an environment for the healing process of trauma, and your therapist will work with you and the other members of your family to help you with that dynamic. But the fact is, there is a personal, individual ownership. And how prepared are the family members to handle the awareness that childhood trauma has occurred? You'll want to have kind of an idea as to, gee, if we bring this topic up, let's say a certain member of the family has in one way not handled or not abused, but maybe abused another member of the family, or somebody from outside the family that the family members know has done that, or somebody in the community has done that, or they experienced something that somebody else has experienced and that trauma is now theirs. How ready is your family to handle the topic of trauma? Now, how can the family prepare for this announcement? Okay, well, let's say two people in the family know that we're dealing with this, and now you kind of need to bring the other members of the family in on the fact that, John has had this experience, everyone. It's bad. We're in treatment with him. And, here are the things that we need to do in order to prepare the family to receive this information. And it could be that, before you make the announcement, you bring up the topic of, what does trauma mean to you, Sally, Donna, Bob? And should one of us have trauma, how do you think you'd feel about it? Well, okay, that's a way to prepare them for the idea that, you haven't announced it yet, but tomorrow morning, you're going to let everybody know that John had this experience and that we are dealing with it, and here's your part to play. So there is a way to kind of prepare your family for that. First step, second step, third step. Put it down in the study guide. Now we start to sit there and take a look at the next step, which is, how does the trauma impact the family? And as we've done in other episodes with other issues, we're using the workbook, module number 2, in order to help us there. So we will turn to the section that is childhood trauma, and we will then understand that there are practical exercises for us to participate in. And in one of the areas, the challenge is that lower grades and more suspensions and expulsions is one of the things that help us to understand, for school-age children, that the problem may be a trauma. An increased use of health and mental services is going to be required. An increased involvement with the child's welfare is going to be needed, and long-term health problems are possible. So when we start to look at trauma and its overall impact to the person, these are areas that we need to be sensitive to. So when we're looking at trauma as an awareness and acceptance and coordination of care, we want to start to look at, what are the possibilities that that they've experienced sexual or physical abuse or psychological abuse. And we've kind of neglected the fact that this has happened to them. What if they witnessed an experience of domestic violence or violence in the community? And now they kind of, as memory-wise, they understand that this is possible. Physical or sexual assault is very large, and it has a span of different behaviors that come from that. Commercial sexual exploitation, some of the things that we do, and it seems like it's just a part of our society, they get exposed to, that's traumatic. If they're not ready for that, and most people aren't, then that is traumatic. It's confusing. We don't know where to necessarily put it and how to cope with it. So sudden violent loss of a loved one, even though it didn't happen to us, or we might not have even seen it, that can be traumatic. A divorce is traumatic. Bullying is traumatic. Social media abuse is very traumatic. And it needs to be treated as trauma, not as a, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Just ignore it. That's not going to work. It's a part of them now. It's trauma. If left untreated, it's going to fester. If left to fester, it's going to come out and exhibit itself in other ways. So one of the concerns is that from the study guide, we noted that 76% of people who are using and misusing substances had a traumatic experience in their lives. Many have had several, and some were major traumas, undiagnosed, untreated, left to fester, and now because they're looking to comfort themselves, is being exhibited out in a desire for, like a self-medication. So had we caught this earlier for this person, could we have avoided the drug addiction? Not necessarily, okay? One does not automatically correlate to the other. However, in relation to they are misusing drugs, probably a good idea to take a look and remember what we said, a trauma inventory, and use some of those screening tools to determine, because that drug addiction isn't going to heal itself in the same way if we are leaving the trauma undiagnosed and untreated. So we may want to go further down and see where that might have happened, and if it did, let's start to nurture that into a place that it doesn't cause this as being a result in terms of their drug addiction and trying to obtain lifelong successful recovery. So when we start to look at the area of trauma, we have to, at the same time, also look at mental health. And we have to also look at substance use disorders. And one of the encouraging things is we could break this down and separate it from child trauma to adult trauma. And we have a scale of questions. Prior to the age of 17, did you experience a death or an awfully close friend of the family member? If yes, how old were you? And then we ask another question, prior to the age of 17, was there major upheaval between your parents? Okay, once again, this is trauma. Now, let's take into account 65% of families experience divorce. Well, then that means a possibility that 65% times the number of kids that are in that family have had a trauma experience. And then the question kind of bleeds itself out in terms of like epidemiology and statistics. Well, then what's the prevalence and occurrence of, trauma inside an American family if 65% of them have experienced trauma, and therefore now what are they exhibiting as conditions of mental health or trying to cope with it by using substances? So prior to age 17, did you have a sexual experience, molested or raped? And I know these are not pleasant topics to discuss, but when it's there, we have to deal with it. We can't just say it's not comfortable for me and I don't want to address it. We don't have that luxury because it's going to present itself in another way and you're going to have to address it, only now it's bigger and more difficult. So were you a victim of violence, either a mugging, an assault? Prior to age 17, were you extremely ill or injured? Did you suffer from a chronic disease? Did somebody you know suffer from a chronic disease that was close to you? Those become traumatic. And then did you experience a major upheaval that may have shaped a life personality significantly? We're not necessarily talking about the theater of war, although that would be an obvious one, It could be, the fact is you just don't feel safe walking home from the school bus to where you live because of the things that you've seen and are experiencing. And that's a repeat trauma. So that repeat over time being constant in the sense of I am constantly experiencing this trauma every day of my life, that builds itself. So it may seem little if by itself you didn't feel comfortable today getting home from school. But if you don't feel comfortable getting home from school every day, then that's trauma. So with that in mind, we can do the same for adults, and we can ask ourselves within the past 3 years, before you were age 17, and ask the same questions, only we're replacing it with within the past 3 years. These are in your workbook, and you can review them for yourselves. Now, if you have a traumatic experience or you suspect a traumatic experience in one of the family members, and you're seeing some of these things that we've described here in the book, and once again, go to the book to review them. Go online and look at some of the YouTubes that are offered. They're excellent, and you'll get a much better understanding of dealing with this. Educate yourself on trauma is what we're suggesting. And then go out and see a professional and ask them, what do you think? Do you think we should bring in Jack to have an assessment done? And it's an ACEs tool. It's a short set of questions, but it's excellent. And it does identify for you that which you were trying to find. Does trauma exist here? And if so, then a further assessments can be done in order to diagnose, is this trauma? And then to determine what stage is it, how severe is it, and then they can start to look at a plan of care for you. So what we've done here is we've re-examined, as we've done before in other episodes, the topic as it relates to the impact on the family. Now what we want to do is we want to sit there and say, okay, if we have trauma, and then that's nice to know. And once again, what are you going to do about it? So we do. We want to make time to, in our examination, determine a solution. Then we want to be able to develop a decision, and then we want to be able to design a plan of action. And at the end of this episode, you'll find that there is a part that takes you through each of these steps. These 3 coping skills are critical. The more often you practice these at the end of our episodes, the stronger you're going to become. And the stronger you become is your ability to take knowledge, which is what this study guide and workbook did. You now are knowledgeable on the topic. You're now knowledgeable on how it's impacting your family. And now in the 3 Ds, the determine a solution, develop a decision, and design a plan of action, you're doing something about it. That's when knowledge becomes empowering. But we're not really at empowerment until we get somebody involved. In other words, up to now, it's been on paper, and this is what we want to do. And it's well designed. These models will guide you easily, once completed, into taking the right next steps. The right next steps is always to go out and find the right resource, which, by the way, we understand is exhausting. And here's why it's exhausting. The industry of mental health and addiction service, recovery services, never got together and said, okay, what's the best way for families to figure out that they've got this situation and what are they going to do about it? It's an industry that kind of like was assembled by parts and pieces and things. And now it's like silo here, a silo there. You go to the ER, but the ER didn't necessarily set you up for the next step, which is where Bob would go into a detox. You had to do that. And the detox didn't exactly set you up for the next step, which is, sober living or wherever you're going to go after you have finished your IOP or your residential treatment time. So in some ways, somebody's sitting there saying, gee, Jack's been, abusing opioids and heroin for some time now, years, and nobody's thought to necessarily say, well, then that's probably hurting his heart, because we know statistically this has a way of damaging the cardiac valve and other types of cardiac conditions. Maybe we should have somebody take a look at him from cardiology. There was nobody that did that because the system isn't set up. We don't manage this like a disease. Now, we call it a disease, and we know that's a chronic disease, but there is no infrastructure in place today, and there could be, but that's a different topic for a different time. The fact is, you're now in disease management, meaning you've got to help them with their addiction, with their dual diagnosis in mental health, and the possibility of a comorbidity, which is a medical condition that's at play here. There could be actually 3 things going on. And we'll discuss that further and get an assessment in terms of what you do in that regard. I want to thank you for taking the time. Childhood trauma and trauma, it takes a lot of courage on the family member's part, because not only are you going to sit there and say, because Jack is going through this, and by the way, I'm sorry for using the name Jack for all the Jacks that are out there, but now what about the other members of the family? I mean, let's face it, they may have had traumatic experiences too. They may not be using substances at this point, but this may manifest in them as well. It more than likely isn't the exact same trauma that this person had, but if trauma exists in your environment, it may be that those people also need to have some form of awareness brought forward. And maybe by taking the time with Jack, it gives you the opportunity to look at the other members of your family as well, which is very nurturing and a very positive next step. Thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Childhood Trauma, Fentanyl, and Families in Harm's Way. Hello, I want to thank you for continuing to view our episode. And we're now going to work into the area of the 3Ds. This is an important characteristic for the family to develop skills in. And we'll start by taking the time to look at an issue and then determine the issues based on the area of determining a solution, developing a decision, and designing a plan of action. By using your Module 3 workbook and going to a specific issue, you'll be able to find that the first step in that 3D skill set is the FTR, the Family Transformational Model. And the Family Transformational Model is a set-up way, each time the same way, that we will take 5 categories to look at in determining a solution. And each category is going to have 3 questions. So let's get started. The first is to define the issue. Naturally, we'll want to know what the issue is. The word issue is really problem, but we're saying the word issue is, the reason we're saying the word issue is it's just a little bit easier to digest, because it's not always a problem. Sometimes it's just something that's happening, and we need to determine a solution to it. The next question is, how does the issue impact the family? We need to know that. We need to know, we have an issue, that's fine. The issues can exist, but if it's impacting the family, in what way is it impacting the family? And then what steps can the family take to prepare and then respond to the issue? That's very important for us to know. The fact is that this issue exists and it's impacting the family. We tend to believe maybe there was something we could have done to kind of get ready for it. And if there was, then we would want to have taken those steps, which is what all these episodes are about. And then who can help assist us and the family in our response. So we want to start to ask ourselves, we know that there's an issue, we know that it's impacting the family, and there are things that we could do to prepare for this, but we're probably going to need a resource, information, another person outside of our family, or maybe one of our family members specifically can use their functionality and contribute. So we want to identify that. And then what should the family expect as their outcome? And kind of a start with the end in mind thought, where we're saying, if we're going to do something, it's going to result in something. So is that result desirable? Is that really what we want? Because if we're going to create a solution, then we want the solution's outcome to be what we expect it would be. So in each of these categories that I just described, 1 through 5, there are 3 questions, and we're going to ask ourselves each of these. Let's go back into the first category, define the issue. Clearly state what happened or what will happen. We want to know very clearly what happened or what's likely to happen. And then write that down. Identify who's involved or who should be involved, and then what would you like to have happen or like to see happen. The third question in every category is going to be used. You'll see how in just a minute. But just remember, the third question in every category, so this question right here, the way you answer it, will be reused. Now the next question is, how is the issue impacting the family? Who in the family exactly is impacted? In what way are they impacted? And then the third question is, what is needed to move forward? And then the third category is, what steps can the family take to prepare and then respond to the issue? The 3 questions again. What needs to be done? And then prioritize that list. Who needs to be involved? And then what will it look like, the third question, what will it look like when completed? Then the 4th category is, who can help and assist the family in their response? The 3 questions are, how to search and organize this organization to help you. In other words, it's not enough that you know you're going to go and introduce yourselves to a treatment center in your community. You want to start to determine, how do I look for them and organize my way of seeking help, because it might not just be that group alone. You may also need other services to kind of start to create a who can assist us. And it may be many different types of people. What to ask from them, and then what to expect. Remember the third question, what to expect. And then the 5th category is, what should the family expect as their outcome? Well, that has to do a lot with timing. And if it takes a certain amount of time, let's be realistic of what that is. That has something to do with the expense of the involvement, of getting involved in this issue. And then the third question being, required changes, our changes as family members, for this response to successfully take place. Now, let's state what our solution is. Hey, this is the great news. You've already developed your solution. By answering each of these 3 questions, the third question in every category, you'll pull forward now into your statement. So your first sentence of your statement is the third answer in the first category. What would you like to have happen or like to see happen? Well, that becomes your first sentence. So what your first sentence for your solution statement is, what we would like to see happen is, and you just pull your answer from there to here. Do the same thing with the second category. How does the issue impact the family? Using the third question's answer, what is needed for the family to move forward? So now your second sentence is, what's needed to move forward is. And now you're accumulating these answers from these categories, the third question, and it's actually becoming your first sentence, your second sentence, your third sentence, your fourth sentence, and your 5th sentence in your solution statement. So your solution statement is going to sound something like, what we would like to see happen is, and what's needed to move forward will be, And then the third question from the third category, what it will look like when completed will be, and then what we expect will be, and then what's required for us to have a successful response is. Now those are your 5 sentences. You've just constructed your solution. And this is how you go about using a model for creating a solution. For any issue in life you have to face, you can use this as a way of approaching it. Now let's go to the other area, which is the second coping skill, making a decision. Let's make a value-based decision. Let's make a decision each time that kind of balances with what we value most. So first we want to determine what are our values. Well, the best way to do that is to write down on a piece of paper, what types of things do you as an individual value most? And each member of your family can do this in a kind of a group exercise. And then once you've done that, I value love, I value honesty, I value relationships and sharing. These could all be an individual's 1, 2, 3. Then prioritize them. Which of the 1, 2, 3 is most important? Then have each member of the family do the same thing. And then you can sit there and say to the family, what was your number 1? What was your number 2? What was your number 1? What was your number 1? What was your number 1? And then what was your 2? What was your 2? What was your 3? What was your 3? And where you start to see many people in the family say, well, my number 1 is relationships, my number 2 was trust, and my number 3 was love. Well, then you talk to another person, they say, well, my number 1 was love, my number 2 was personal expression or confidentiality, or so they mentioned something different, but they did mention love. And then the third member of the family happens to mention love also. You know now that love is a value of the family. So whatever decisions you make, you want to balance it on the fact of, does this disrupt our values? If it does, at least you know that it does, and to what degree. You're calculating that. But at least also you're including, what do we value most? Let's make sure our decisions don't counter that. And now, in the first step, we're going to identify exactly what's happened. And this is, by the way, in your book, okay? And it is for each of the episodes. Now, identify exactly what's happened, what happened, how did it happen, who did it happen to. Then the second step is analyze the situation, assess the problem, identify the problem, and in what areas did the problem create an impact. You're writing all of these down. The third step of that the third step in the decision-making model is, what is the number of one contributing factor? What is causing this issue to take place? You need to know that before you make a decision. The fourth step is, now that you know the number 1 factor, you need to go out and find out what information there is about this. Your primary source, you're going to go to the actual person or organization that's involved with this and ask them, what is this issue? And help us to understand it better. The secondary source would be, somebody's telling you this happened, or somebody suggests that you should do something a certain way, and it's coming from somebody else other than the primary source. It could be an article, a clinical paper. These are all secondary sources, and you gather them and you make them part of your primary, secondary information gathering. The third area that you look at is your gut. What does your gut, because that's often where our faith comes in, and other things that are very important when making decisions get included. So trust your gut is what we're saying in the decision-making process. The fifth step in making a good quality decision is where you're taking a criteria and saying, let's take what we're going to make a decision about and let's balance it on the criteria to make sure that we're covering all of our bases. And this will ensure safety of your loved one. Is safety a part of what's being considered? And do we have the resources that are needed to do the decision we're looking at? And then, do we understand the timetable? Is it realistic? And do we understand the negative impacts? Because every decision has a positive and negative. Well, identify what the negative outcomes might be so that you can weight the factor of, is this a good decision? And then, would you do this would you ask others to do this if they were doing it for you, meaning it was done for you or to you? Is this still a good decision? These are all areas that you want to take a look at. The third coping skill is in the area of the family plan of action. And everybody could say, well, Roy, listen, we're just going to go out and do it. Well, it's going to get done a lot more effectively. I want to warn you that the addiction industry is not organized. And then again, either is the family. So you're taking two disorganized organizations and you're putting them together. So a plan is a very good idea. The other factor is you're going to more than likely require the assistance of a lot of different groups. And as time goes by, those groups are going to change. And now it's a whole new set of groups that you're dealing with. When you're at the hospital, the ER, that's what that is. Then you move over to detox, that's what that is. Then you move over to therapy and treatment, and that lasts for 16 weeks. That's what that is. Then you're looking at sober living, recovery, maybe incarceration, and then reentry, on all that's involved in that. So there's all sorts of reasons why a plan put on paper based on the decision and the information gathering that you've made, based on the solution that you know you want to use, are very good ideas. It all comes together with the plan of action. Then you take the plan of action and you go find a professional to help you. Everything that we've done up to now is to position you to a place where you can be properly assisted and directed and supported. This is what's often missing in the families. This is what exhausts the families. This is where the families get into fights internally on. So, for that reason, we're going to apply the 3D coping skills. Determine a solution. We're going to develop a decision, and we're going to design a plan of action. And we're going to do it each time. I hope this is helpful for you. I'm confident it will be.